honored to be among the finalists of the Ash Award. And the problem that many of these projects reflect is the way our democracy is degraded in not living up to the aspiration that people's voices are actually linked sufficiently to power structures to make a meaningful difference. After the horrendous tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School, when President Obama announced the actions the administration would take, he made a very critical decision to call for a national discussion on mental health rather than to do another White House commission on mental health, of which there have been 5 since President Carter. When he called for that, he said, we want to change the conversation on mental health, to bring it out of the shadows into the light, and we want to create the opportunity for communities to take proactive action. We were called upon, we're both members of a 6-organization steering committee, all deliberative democracy organizations, to lead this initiative called Creating Community Solutions. And from moment one, we had 2 purposes: to meet the president's call on the impact on mental health, but at the same time to do that work in a way that would build the capacity and the infrastructure in each community that we worked in so they would have the ability to repeat this on another wicked problem, whatever that might be for their community or for our nation. The initiative was built on 3 strategies. The first strategy was 6 lead cities. The heart of the strategy was for a commitment to bring together an inclusive, literally everyone in the city's voice represented. Signed off on by mayors, county commissioners, state legislatures, and in some cases, U.S. members of Congress. And to pull together an unlikely group of organizations in the community that would step up to take accountability for implementing the community's highest priorities, so that the work about the actions would not just be your traditional mental health organizations, but it was criminal justice, it was primary physicians being trained in mental health first aid, and in all the communities there were at least 20 to 25 organizations. The second strategy was to create a portal in which any community in the United States of America, on the basis of an individual, an organization, could access all of the resources that we created with SAMHSA, the discussion guide, the policy frameworks, the designs. It could be an hour, it could be 7 hours, so that all those resources, all you had to do was link. You could even get webinars and training your facilities. To date, in not quite 2 years, almost 300 communities in the United States have availed themselves of that possibility, and their outcomes are amazing. The third strategy, many of you probably know this, but in the United States of America, 75% of the people who suffer from serious mental illness, the first symptoms occurred when they were between 13 and 24. Most of them go undiagnosed and untreated. So there was a real effort to bring this into communities in a way in which it would recognize how young people could in fact have the courage to speak up and get treatment. We knew we had to go where young people hang out, so we created a platform that integrates texting, talking, and social media. To date, 24,000 young people have participated in this. They are across the age span, they're across ethnicity and race, and sexual orientation, which is a really huge issue for many young people. In addition to that, that portal has already been applied to vets on the issue of suicide. It's being applied in North Carolina on the issue of high school graduation. And we've just recently had a reach out from the environmental community about how to use the Text Talk Act on climate change. I'll highlight just a couple of outcomes, and hopefully we can talk more in the Q&A. One of the things we're most impressed by is one city has already put in public funds at the level of $1.2 million for an anti-stigma campaign, completely governed and run by young people in that city. Washington, D.C.
Great.
One of the other major issues is transition age youth. Almost all of the key cities have created housing opportunities for 18 months for those young people who leave their parents' homes but have not matriculated into adult life. Now, For those of us who've blood, sweat, and tears in the last 2 years to do this, our long-term goal was as important to us as the impact on mental health. And that was to begin to build the local community structure that would enable communities to repeat this on their own. And I'm just going to end with a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I'd give my life for simplicity on the other side of complexity. And that's the big problems in the country today. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to congratulate you. I think, as we've talked earlier, mental health is such a difficult challenge, and it's difficult to talk about it, and it's difficult to figure out what you can do about it. So I would love to hear what are some of the solutions that, I love the idea that you're focused on the young people, because obviously that's critically important. But what would be some of the solutions other than the anti-stigma campaign, which is, I would really appreciate hearing from you. And maybe, Martha, we're going to hear from you.
Yes. That's great. One of the things that was really interesting to us is that very similar themes came out of the conversations around the country, whether it was through Text, Talk, and Act, through some of the organic conversations through the portal, or whether it was through a lead city. And so it was really fascinating to hear that wherever people were coming from, the priorities they identified in terms of solutions, not surprising. First, they said we need to continue to change the conversation, and we need to have young people leading the change in the conversation about mental health. The other things that came up was we need to focus.
When you say change the conversation, could you be more specific?
Sure. That usually people keep mental health very secret in their family because there's a certain shame or stigma attached to it. And so one of the things that has come out is that we really need to have people standing up to take that kind of courage to say what they faced in their own lives, their own families. And often when young people do that, that helps initiate the conversation for other young people. So it's really having the conversation is changing the conversation. And people, these conversations identified solutions, but not surprisingly, one of the solutions is we need to keep talking. We need to enlarge the table of people who are in the conversation. And another solution that they identified was early identification and early intervention, because as we noted before, that really makes a huge difference when there's early intervention, and yet a lot of times we're not gearing services and training to that. So a lot of what grew out of the solutions that grew out of these things were things like mental health first aid, or training in crisis intervention for first responders like firefighters or police officers or judges, people in the criminal justice system. And a third thing that came out that Carolyn alluded to at the end of her remarks was really the need to really focus services on transition age youth, who often are falling between the cracks because they haven't gotten the kinds of targeted services that they need, the wraparound services that they need when they face mental health challenges and don't have jobs and maybe don't have families to fall back on. And so what is the community doing for them? And so those were some of the areas where some of the solutions, ideas for solutions came out, and we could give examples of different cities moving on those actions.
Can I give just, for example,
Sure.
Sacramento County? The superintendent of schools put in a policy that every child, when they're getting their health examination when they start school, now also gets a mental health assessment. Wow, that's impressive. In another city, all primary care physicians have been given training on how to get a mental health assessment. So part of the mantra that is coming is mental health is just an aspect of health, and we should learn to treat it that way.
That's very impressive. Very, very impressive. Thank you. Pete?
I wasn't quite sure about the contents of the participant/leader guide. This wasn't simply an invitation to have a conversation about mental health. There was at least some prompting to it, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how those materials were developed and just give us a little bit of insight as to how a conversation was prompted.
We developed those materials in concert with SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of HHS. And we also, the 6 organizations, pooled our knowledge about what works for public conversations, and we put those kinds of things together. So yes, it was a combination of information about mental health, so trying to provide ways, in very simple ways, in the public engagement process to help people understand brain science, for example, or to understand what kinds of early interventions might make a difference. So giving people a chance to be informed. But the conversations themselves really started with people having a chance to talk about what was their connection to the issue. And then there was a chance to talk about what were they facing in their own communities.
Could you just give us a sense of what that question might sound like?
Sure. Carolyn, do you remember the exact question?
It doesn't have to be exact.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact question.
In all this kind of public deliberation where you're trying to equalize what level of expertise or education, you start with a question about your life experience.
Right.
So whether it was an hour in a church or whether it was one of our 7-hour meetings, the first question was, can you share an example of what mental health impact has had in your life?
Right.
Then we also used 4 questions that were always the same because we wanted to get to the place of where in your community currently is access to mental health services known about, understood? Where and what are the issues in your community, particularly with youth, but it was open for adults as well? What's missing? What in your community would take a step forward to help young people? And then that turned into the criteria for what are actual solutions that would build on the assets our community have and would get over the gaps that we know are there. So those were consistent across all communities.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yes. Skip and then.
Mr. Mayor.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
One of the issues we've talked about is sustainability. And you raised it as perhaps one of your greatest challenges. So if you could spend just a minute talking about both the challenge and overcoming that for the program.
I think that one of the reasons that we responded to this challenge is that for years we had been talking amongst deliberative democracy organizations about how to provide supports for a national dialogue that at the same time helped local efforts build and sustain their efforts. So I think when we think about sustainability, we think of it in 2 levels. One is helping to support what local governments and their nonprofit and business partners are doing to sustain the engagement and implementation process. And I think that's been something that has been, that's always a challenge because it requires both government commitment and the commitment of funders and nonprofits to actually keep up the process of reaching out into the community to bring people to the table who aren't usually there. And then I think there's one question about sustainability for the, if you're talking about CCS, the national initiative generally, has been that we have been, pouring a lot of, as Carolyn said, blood, sweat, and our own sweat equity into this because we believe it's important to do it. But it has also been, it's been, a difficult thing to kind of keep going in the terms of finding the necessary funds that would, for example, help us centralize some of the supports that we could provide to local communities to expand that somewhat. So, but we believe that it's actually gaining momentum. And so right now our question is, as now over 40,000 people across the country have sat down with each other in very deep community-based conversations, we think that it's gaining momentum, and so it's kind of taken on a life of its own. There's a learning community among the lead sites, and people are very connected, and the other communities who've entered. So I think that the question of sustainability is the work will definitely sustain in many of the local communities, and then the question is how do we help sustain and support this kind of national dialogue effort when the opportunities for that kind of discussion arise.
I'm still trying to get at, I get the national dialogue and the power of that. That, in other words, rather than having a commission, we're really going to engage the country in a network kind of almost like a positive view of the kind of Borg. Everybody's in the community working together and leveraging one another. I get that, but I'm still trying to get at how this translates translates into, or should it, is it fair to ask it to translate into national action with impacts? I get the disparate impacts, but it seems like it's very well organized, focused, integrated, everything when it comes to the dialogue, but you're just, you're just in the inchoate stages now, trying to figure out how this translates into action. Talk to me about that. Because the devil's advocate is that this is a great way to have discussions, but is it a great way to really make an impact and have it resound?
There's no question on the local level, the impacts
I can talk
are.
to you because we worked together for a long time. Okay.
On the local level, there's already all kinds of evidence that can be tracked over time. To date, this is what I'd say about the national level. Because the themes that came out in this conversation, whether it was a border town in the Southwest or whether it was a big city or a small city, were very similar, we've already seen the impact that's having locally, state, and national on policymakers thinking about where their efforts should be focused. California is probably the state in the country that was the most sophisticated at a state legislation level in mental health. A senator named Darrell Steinberg had passed into law 2 decades ago, or more than 2 decades ago. And what was fascinating to us when we just had this meeting of all the cities in Sacramento was the leaders in Sacramento said that what this has done has now rebreathed life into the Mental Health Act, because in every community it's a younger generation that is now the voices for mental health and more diverse than they'd ever seen before. And the second was because it was organizations, not just mental health organizations, but schools, crime, primary health care physicians. So I think in that regard, the effects at the state level and the national level are going to turn out to be in policy and resource allocation. And it'll take a longer tail for those to all show.
Thank you. Congratulations for all the good work you've done.
Thank you.